Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, peasants, death slave, serfs, enemies of the state, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot, and today I would like to do a book review, old-fashioned book review. That's this book called Pentagonism, A Substitute for Imperialism by Juan Bosch. And a very important book. It was written in 1968. When I first read it some 20, 30 years ago, I expected it to have something anachronistic and outdated in it. And it all held up. Solid truth. Great picture of something that's going on in the world today. And it was going on in 1968 and it's going on now. And you can read the book now and it is still far from outdated and is very relevant. Juan Bosch certainly knows what he's talking about. This is Juan Bosch. He was the elected leader of a constitutional democracy in the Dominican Republic in '62 after a dictator was toppled. And, of course, Juan Bosch himself, his government was toppled by a CIA-backed military coup. And so this is a guy who knows what he's talking about. This is a very important book. The birth of Pentagonism, of course, is the post-World War II era and the Cold War. I mean, we have this massive industry build-up during World War II. And it wasn't about to go away after feeding on those huge profits during the war. So during the 50s, the military-industrial complex came into its own. There was obviously concerns previous to that about the military-industrial complex because there was a series of hearings in Congress back in the 30s, and they held over 90 hearings about the greed and manipulations by the munitions industry after World War I. So none of this is too new. So one of the things that marks this post-World War II era is the undeclared wars. Nearly all the wars since World War II, and some would say even including World War II, are undeclared wars, and that way they don't fall under the same legal categorizations, and you can bypass Congress and all that. And, of course, during the 50s and the post-war period, they used the fear of communism and the expansion of communism, and now we just have the fear of terrorism and jihadism and the spread of Islam, so we just changed one boogeyman for another. According to Lenin and Marx, this is a natural result of overdeveloped capitalism. This sort of military-industrial complex state, and can hardly argue that fact. It's hard to say where one ends and the other begins in these new crony capitalism, military-industrial state. So, and the other beautiful thing about Pentagonism, of course, compared to imperialism, is that Pentagonism includes financiers, industrialists, businessmen, educators, workers, writers, journalists, advertising men, politicians, clergy, economists, and they're all the new privileged groups. The business is so lucrative, it's easy to co-opt all sectors with the high salaries and the rapid development. So what are the features of Pentagonism? Well, you have this previous model used during the 19th century and early 20th century of massive armies going over, taking control and occupying a country for as long as it takes, setting up a local government infrastructure or a puppet government, and ruling the country and extracting the resources that way. That model is no longer as practical. So with Pentagonism, you occupy the country economically. We still see the model of puppet governments and setting up our own, quasi-legal administrations. So these different facets shift and change, but there's the same basic thing, just morphing from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century into the 20th century, now into the 21st century. So what are the factors? What are the main points of this Pentagonism? Well, and bear in mind, Juan Bosch wrote this in 1968. So this is 40 years ago. He says, Pentagonism, main point is to keep a permanent military market through permanent war. through the vast profits of the munitions industry. And of course now we're in a state of perpetual war like we've never been. Although the 20th century and now the 21st century have always been active, so munitions makers, of course, have been making lots of money, and they like it. They're used to it, and they want to keep it that way. Juan Bosch says that traditional foreign policy no longer has a reason for being. The civil heads of the old international policy, the President and Secretary of State, now have a limited function to approve the plans of Pentagonism. And we've seen that. The people who develop our foreign policy are not the President, not the Secretary of State. They're there to carry out orders. They have handlers. There's people behind the screens that decide this thing, and there are people in the shadow government and the military-industrial complex, and they have a vested interest in keeping the war machine going at full bore and globally. Juan Bosch says that there are only military options in foreign policy because the U.S. is no longer a civil power directed by politicians. It is a military power directed by an association of bankers, industrialists, and military leaders. So obviously that model still holds true. Our foreign policy is no longer about diplomacy. Every step is a step either towards war or out of war to get into the next war. So that is our foreign policy now. I like the irony that we always say that war is the last resort, but in our foreign policy now it's the first resort. And of course both parties are completely aligned with Pentagonism. Juan Bosch knew that in 1968, and we have people now that find that hard to believe, but it's not hard to believe at all. Both parties line up quickly for the police state and foreign military adventures. They'll drag their feet on anything that has to do with actually helping the citizens of this country, but they'll certainly grease the wheels for the military-industrial complex. A very important point Juan Bosch brings up is the justification for these wars by always calling offense defense. And we certainly live in that era when none of these countries really poses an existential or even relative threat to us in most respects, and yet we are constantly invading and bombing in other countries, saying that's defense, national defense. So, and this is one of the more interesting aspects of what Juan Bosch says in this book, and that is that the mother country is colonized. And that explains a lot about the current state of America, where the middle class, the manufacturing base, is all being dismantled. We're going to end up with the very wealthy and then a gigantic service industry, massive immigrant workforce. And the country feels like corporations have turned their backs on the United States. And they have. Because for us, they've transcended national boundaries in America. We're only of use to corporations because they use our military to defend their interests across the globe. That is their only connection with this country anymore. They have no allegiances, no affiliations. We're just another market to be exploited. And they need to shift everything in this country now to balance out with their global economic aspirations. So in this case, the mother country is colonized through taxes to pay for the military. So not only that, we pay for our own enslavement. They use our money, our labor, as debt slaves. So we labor to get out our minimum. The money goes back to the government. They spend it on the military-industrial complex. And we supply them with cannon fodder, especially the poor working classes. So, and that's why consumerism is the main focus of America. And that's another reason why the military-industrial complex and the handlers are going to turn their back on this country, and that is because we've outlived our use as consumers. We're maxed out. They soaked us with debt, soaked us with consumerism. We bought every piece of crap in sight, and now they know we're maxed out. We're tapped out, and they're going to go elsewhere. They got bigger markets in China and India, and that's where they're all moving. That's where their eyes are set on, and that's the future. So, America, we're on our own. So the advantage of military capitalism is there's huge profits made before the products are even necessarily used. And that's another one of the great things about the military-industrial complex. All their products, all the weapons makers, they sell their arms, and for the most part, globally, percentage-wise, a lot of it is not used. So they just get service, advisors, training. They get gouged on the original prices, and that keeps the industry flush with massive profits. So, and to add on to that point I was making earlier about how superfluous the mother country is now, we supply the men and the war machinery and the profits. But politically, America is of no value to the handlers, the bankers, the industrialists, the weapon manufacturers, and everyone else. So, you know, and I think it's interesting, too, that in this book, Pentagonism, he talks about the Eisenhower speech, which, of course, was pretty contemporary to his own time. But he points out that 5 years after Eisenhower gives his speech about warning about the military-industrial complex, he was urging the atom bomb to be dropped on North Vietnam. So I guess when you get up into the government echelons, then being co-opted and being part of the military-industrial complex is the only option there is. So anyway, highly recommend it. Very hard to come by. I noticed on the last year there's only been one copy on eBay, but well worth the search. Pentagonism, A Substitute for Imperialism by Juan Bosch, written in 1968. And I guarantee every single page of it is still relevant, and I recommend anybody interested in what's going on in American foreign policy and our economics and what's going on behind the screen, what the experience that foreign leaders have of our foreign policy and their valuable insights into it, and how insidious and overpowering and overbearing the military-industrial complex really is. So I recommend everybody get a copy as soon as they can.